Hello, I'm Cindy Zhu with the U.S. Department of Energy. I'd like to welcome you to the March edition of the Better Buildings webinar series. In this series, we profile the best practices of Better Buildings Challenge and Alliance partners and other organizations working to improve energy efficiency in commercial buildings. Next slide, please. Today, we will focus on considering energy performance in real estate appraisals and valuation. High-performance buildings are more energy efficient, consume fewer natural resources, can improve the health and productivity of occupants, and can lower operational and ownership risks. Because of these numerous benefits, properly valuing these measures is an integral component to maximizing the return on investment. Next slide, please. Let me give you a little more detail about our presenters today. We'll first hear from John K. Scott at Better Buildings Alliance partner Colliers International, who will describe Colliers' strategy for addressing value creation in high-performance buildings. John has over 30 years of experience in commercial asset management and project leasing. As the Senior Vice President of Colliers International in Florida, he is directly responsible for the Florida Real Estate Management Services Department, where he directs a portfolio of over 115 retail, office, and industrial properties in excess of 10 million square feet. Joining John in this conversation will be Devesh Nirmal, principal and owner of Inspyrod, where he has worked with commercial real estate organizations like Colliers on advancing market transforming energy and sustainability solutions and practices. Devesh is also senior director with Renew Financial, where he is helping to enable the rollout of high-performance energy financing mechanisms throughout Florida. Our third speaker is Phoebe Wright-Chappell, CEO of Sustainable Values, whose business is specializing in valuation consulting, due diligence, impact investing, and optimizing real estate returns for clients. Phoebe is a national and international speaker and educator on the implications of green strategies on asset value. She recently premiered a one-day course developed with the Department of Energy titled Energy Matters that addresses the growing relevance of energy in the built environment and its implications on real estate property value. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. Next slide, please. Before we get started with our presentation, sorry, John, I want to remind our audience that we will hold questions until near the end of the hour. Please send in questions through the chat box on your webinar screen throughout the session today, and we will try to get as many of them as we can. The session will be archived and posted for the web for your reference. So to start us off, let's hear from both John Scott at Colliers and Devesh Nirmal of Inspyrod. John, what is Colliers doing to properly value high-performance buildings?
Well, first off, I want to thank my fellow speakers who I've worked with on numerous opportunities. Right now I work with Devesh on the BOMI Valuation High Performance 3 building. So I appreciate him being on the call, and also with Dee Wright, who I previously had worked with, and her green building development project that she did with the index many years ago. So thank you both for being on this call with us, and thank you for inviting us to the call. To give you some background on what Colliers is doing in regards to the next slide, and the slide after that. Thank you. Reconciling high performance benefits with valuation impacts in the marketplace. First off, starting off with high performance features, we have a lot of data out in the marketplace, but how much of that data is usable? How much of it is valuable? That's one of the issues we face in trying to reconcile it to a valuation impact in the marketplace. Number two, when we look at the types and scopes of benefits, there's visible and invisible type of operations that are going on. One is when you walk into a space and you see water bottle fillers. I call that part of the visible environment. But when we see employee efficiency and productivity increase, that's one of the invisible components that go into valuation. And then which stakeholders receive the benefit? We have to look at the different types. There's ownerships, which could be a pension fund, could be private equity. There's tenants who are corporate tenants, or they could be LLCs or sole proprietorships. But we also have to add in the leasing, the management components, engineering, and service providers for that entire environment to try and build the true value of projects. Later on, we'll discuss some of the impacts on valuation approach, the market validation of value. And at any time during this session, Didi, Devesh, I would love for you to jump in on my slides. As you know, I'm very interactive and would have anything that adds value for our audience. Next slide. So I'm going to go through some basic information just so it's front of mind for all of us. Present value is the value of a future asset expressed in present dollars. As we all know, the value of money in present value is at the highest potential. Next slide. Net present value is the investment cost from the after-tax present value of project savings. Later on, as we're going through some of the calculations and we're looking at cap rates and NOIs, this will be very, very helpful to you. Next slide. So most of us in the management or leasing world work with a very simple income strategy, which is net operating income, potential lease minus the vacancy and credit losses. Any other income, which in today's time seems to be a lot in parking garages, but parking garages have an impact on the value of a building significantly. As one case and example, I have a project in South Beach that has a parking garage that's open to public parking. 1/3 of the revenue from that building is generated by the parking garage, but also that brings in sustainability components that should be discussed. And then, of course, we minus the operating expenses. Next slide. And then in the end, when we're talking to our ownerships and or the investors, we're looking at what's the ROI, our gains minus cost divided by the cost of this. Again, later on in our case studies, which Devesh is going to focus on more, we're going to have an open discussion on this. Next slide. So looking at the conventional building and the high energy efficient building, this is what I utilize when I've sat in front of CEOs and CFOs. And for those of you on the phone, and if you're CEOs or CFOs, this is not a slight by any means, but if many of you remember with the new computers that were being produced, and if Start Me Up or Windows 95 comes to mind, there used to be something that occurred called a blue screen, meaning when you booted it up and it didn't operate right, it'd give you a blue screen and you'd have to turn it off again. Well, I look at the high energy efficiency or sustainable model in that way too. When I would go and present to a CFO or a CEO and I would try and run these numbers by, if I didn't engage them within the first minute or two, I got what I called the blue screen, meaning I would have to reboot or come back. But when you present a model, as you see on the right-hand side, where it shows a delta between the recoverable operating expenses and the amount of energy costs and the rent, there's a delta there that increases the value as well as reduces the operating costs for the ownership. Next slide. And this is not up-to-date information, as I have not seen any newer information, but it's very powerful in the fact that when we're looking at this, and Devesh, I was going to ask you to jump into this a little bit just to talk about.
Absolutely, appreciate it. Thank you, John. So in just some context, John and I have been looking at these issues from the perspective of the tangible types of changes and updates and upgrades that happen in buildings or the investments in green buildings down to the actual valuation type calculations that take place or the standard financial calculations. So throughout this presentation, we're kind of going back and forth. This will be consolidated in part of what we've been putting together. The point here, though, is empirically, what are we seeing in the marketplace when you do have a sustainable feature, a high-performance building? How does it impact these metrics that are important to us when it comes to investment decisions? And I'll just highlight a couple here. So the rent premium for green. So this study back, I think the last version of this was like
2008.
2008, yeah. You know, there's a premium here for green. And then when we look at the analysis that John presented at the beginning of his presentation, well, what's driving that? Is it something tangible? Is it intangible? At the end of the day, it's important for us in the community of running these buildings and trying to make them perform at the highest level is to recognize that there is some sort of impact and we should try to account for it.
Well, and you know what I believe, Devesh, I think because of the recession that occurred, as we were just talking about, this 2008 numbers, the market fell off, and that's going to lead into our income and our market, our sales approach with valuation, because at this time the ledge fell out from under everything, and values dropped not because of sustainable projects, but because of the entire market.
And that includes occupancy.
And that includes occupancy as well, yes.
And so it's a dynamic thing. You've got to keep track of all these things. And so I think the next one, decreased operating expenses, a very obvious one that John just highlighted, a very important contribution it provides to the net operating income.
So deltas are important to us. If we can't see, if we're just looking and presenting a reduction in operating expenses, that's not sexy, guys. But if we show revenue increasing on the other side of that to create that delta, then you are able to get past the blue screen because you engage the investors and the people who are going to make these decisions.
And I think the stakeholder piece then, as you just mentioned, investors, and I would even include tenants. I know work with a building where they're giving their tenants credits every year because of their base building reductions. They're able to credit back on the fees that the tenants pay. So that's
and I totally agree with you, and that's why I expanded that stakeholders at the beginning. It's just so hard to talk about all the stakeholders involved here, and I think that's a part of creating the valuation, and I know Thede is going to jump into that later on.
And we can add another layer to the productivity value to the tenants if you can actually show them what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you haven't financially accounted for it. Let's say we do air quality. I know that's a tough thing to get into, but point is, we're reinforcing with the fact that we have high-performance building on the financial side, but we can also reinforce on sustainability features. And I think the new well standard is a good example of trying to capture some of that.
And that's a whole different subject matter. We're not even going to embrace.
We're not going to go into it. But, and then the final one is the cap rate reduction, this idea of the lending community, when it comes to understanding the value of projects and supporting the financing needed for this, wherever that's possible. This basis point reduction seems to be a very interesting phenomenon that we want to track a bit more as well. There's a couple of other things here. This data is, it's available. Next slide, please.
So with the capitalization rate, I just want to talk about it, just to read off here shortly. Most of y'all will laugh in a few minutes when I say capitalization rates commonly fall between 6% and 10%. Well, in some of the very hot markets, and I won't even say one's close to a bubble, it goes well below a 6% capitalization rate at this point in time. And what's driving that? Obviously, the appraisal value of it's escalating and the operating costs are falling, and that's what we were just talking about a moment ago. So it's changing the dynamics in the marketplace, and through sustainable initiatives, through many other types of initiatives, we're seeing that occur. Now, in Devesh, as we're going to go into a case study later on, some of this leads back to the NOI of the project, right?
Right.
And we are going to utilize this scenario in the appraisal or sales value as we go forward. Next slide. So let's talk about sales comparison. This is where I've had the most difficulty with our different ownerships and our different stakeholders in means, because there are so many different attributes to it. In the sales comparative, I'm going to use one of the towns that both Devesh and I have worked in, the greater Miami area, which was outside the top 30 in green buildings years ago and is now in the top 10 because of significant changes. The recession actually created an environment where sales comps added in a sustainability component. There was 2 million square feet of office space, or 3 high-rises that were going to be delivered within an 18-month period in downtown Miami. In the beginning, none of them have looked at sustainable initiatives. As the recession folded in and they were continuing their construction, they started looking at it and saying, well, how do I differentiate myself? And what occurred is the first building said, you know what, I want to become LEED certified. Within a month, the second building said, well, you know what, I'm going to do one better than that. I'm going to be silver. And then finally, the last building came back and said, I'm going to be platinum. And they created a sales comparison differentiator between them. And those buildings, all 3 opened and are all 3 prominent in the Miami marketplace now. And that was one of the subtle ways you started seeing the sales comparison. But how do you measure that? I think, Devesh, how do we get in and say, well, how much value did that add to it? I know it added a box on the leasing broker and the tenant scale, but
right.
What else? How else do you measure that?
Well, certainly, first of all, if they're fully occupied, we want to know the tenants and what their motivation was to move in there. But then there's going back to the day-to-day. What's the operating cost? So we needed to go beyond just the certification and look at some of the empirical data of what's going on in those buildings.
Ah, that's a great point.
And that's not always something that we're paying close attention to. But I think most of the buildings we've worked with, one of the first key points is look at a utility bill.
Yep.
Understand what's going on and where the opportunity might be right off the bat. Now, with the LEED certified process, with commissioning, et cetera, you hope that you've gotten a grip on that early on. And so there's any kind of, anomalies in how the building's operating versus design, which is a big challenge that they're addressed.
So speaking of that anomaly, before I go on to our income approach, there were a lot of buildings that I met with developers that Colliers was looking at, and they said, we're going to build it to LEED core and shell, but we're not going to certify the building. Do you have any thoughts on the impact of those type of buildings or in the marketplace?
I think in those cases, you definitely have to be looking at the data. Like, how are you able to take those build-to criteria and tie it back to performance that you can, account for? For example, I mentioned the commissioning. I know in some of the actual certified cases, it's required to have a fundamental level of commissioning. That's mainly to make sure that things are running the way they're designed. And so you're getting the data, you're getting the energy performance that you expected. But
well, I see the value if they were going to sell it as an empty building.
Right.
Okay.
But
right.
As far as existing,
but when you add the tenants into it, and you would think that the design. Okay, so we built to a LEED silver, which there's more of those than any other type of buildings right now at this time. But the tenants aren't all LEED certified users of that space, right? So that creates a conflict.
There's a variation in the potential. I mean, every two buildings of the same design can operate very differently based on your fact that you're just presenting. And some tenants desire certified space, or it's up to maybe a negotiation, a green lease potentially to get some sort of level of performance agreement between the ownership and the tenants. So it's not just what you do when you build it. It's really about implementing a regime and a culture and operation.
So I wonder, and just speaking out loud, having this conversation, if you own a LEED certified building, we'll say silver, and you only lease to LEED certified tenants come in, is there a value that's added to that? I know there's not a quantifiable value at this time, but do we see that as a value? And I'm just using LEED. It could be any certification that's out there.
Yeah, I would just jump back to the data. Like, if you have the LEED reporting requirements, you're tracking certain pieces of data too, and maybe that automatically is giving value. But as long as there's a commitment to all these pieces.
And I know Dee sitting back there going, I can't wait to get on my turn on this. So appreciate that, Dee. So next slide, please. So I'm going to transition over into Devesh's component of this presentation, but the income approach typically is the one that we focus on because it measures those high-performance investments, it demonstrates them, and we're able to analyze the reduced operating expenses. And I know you're going to share some case studies, so I'd like to turn it over to you now, Devesh.
Sure. And before we hop into that, we're just going to talk about some basic financial scenarios here with the next slide, please. So this slide is entitled cap rate, and not to confuse everybody, because there's a certain way cap rate's used in the commercial industry, but there's also a way of looking at rate of return. So I'm going to just focus really on the ROI, not so much the title of the slide, just to give you an idea. What we're doing here with this example is we're showing that we're going to have a chiller replacement that's going to occur. Whether it's high efficiency or not, in the marketplace, what tends to happen is the newer system is going to be more efficient. What we want to show is how do we value those efficiency benefits and maintenance benefits. Now, in a typical ROI, we're not going to be doing this 25-year type of analysis. We're going to look to see when we recover our initial investment. But if you do sort of make this sort of a life cycle piece without the time value of money adjustment, as you would do with net present value, you're going to see that there's a benefit that builds up over the lifetime here of this building and the equipment, actually, specifically.
And that's a quantifiable benefit.
Yes, very quantifiable. So, of course, like I said, if this was NPV, you'd see some numbers would be a little different because you're adjusting for the time value of money. But generally speaking, the idea of having this chiller and the reduced maintenance, reduced energy costs. This is a rough example. We haven't really looked at escalation rates of utility rates in here, but it's built in. You get this ROI of 160%. Looking at the first year, it's a much smaller piece at 16%. But let's move on to next slide, please. And here's another case. So getting more to John's earlier example of the net operating income impact on the cap rate, on why it makes sense for investor owner to consider these improvements. And here we have an example of a building with a net operating income of $85K. That was the result of looking at the the vacancy and credit losses, the parking revenue. John mentioned that as an example, and of course operating expenses. What we're trying to look at here is when we shift out that operating expense line item, how that impacts our cap rate. And as in this case, we have an appraisal value of $950,000. With that net operating income, we have a cap rate of close to 9%. Now we'll get into the case study of the energy efficiency piece. Next slide, please. So let's take that same learning and apply it to an energy efficiency scenario. We have two here. We have a nuance, and this is because you want to be looking things in a very dynamic fashion. The first one is just straight up energy efficiency. What happens to a building assuming a 10% cap rate in the marketplace? You have an adjusted gross income that you take into account based on the vacancy and losses, and then you have an operating expense here, 70K, and this is relative to that original example of what we had of, let's say, 100 before. So the this is the pre-upgrade, the column. So this is 70K without the upgrades. Right. Ignore what I just said. It's not connected to the previous slide. So the next column then is we have the actual reduction in operating expenses as a result of the energy efficiency measure. Now you see the increase in value dramatically up there, roughly almost, well, 200K.
250,000.
Yeah. And then the second row here is just sort of a nuance. The idea is that if we are attracting more tenants to a building, as John mentioned, the Miami buildings, you create the hype. You get the Fortune 500s that need to have that, or the GSA clients that want to have a requirement. It's not a matter of they want it or not; they just need to do it. Well, you're having more occupancy, and you're going to have running your systems at a higher capacity. You're going to be using more energy, right? So we want to adjust for that a little bit. However, we still see here, because we have less vacancy, we're able to still capitalize on that, and we still have.
Well, Devesh, what you just told me is if the occupancy is lower or higher, you're still seeing a substantial value.
That's the lesson here. That's the lesson. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
So if I take a building that's at 95% occupancy at a pre-upgrade value versus a high performance, then we're going to see this type of value added to it, regardless.
Regardless, yeah. So this is just to kind of clarify that even those other changes that happen, we're not really. They don't impact the bigger picture too much.
Gotcha.
Okay, next slide, please. So the life cycle analysis, we've hinted to this earlier, and the ROI example provided that. There's the concept of life cycle costing, looking at costs and over time. We use analysis because we know there's a lot of variables out there we could be looking at that would incur over time. I mean, I've talked to John's engineer about the magnetic chiller technology and how that totally changes the maintenance repair paradigm for the buildings that have that technology. There's also, you never know what's down the road in terms of incentives, changes in utility costs. But also, if we start to quantify some of those sustainability benefits that we're not currently quantifying, if we have a carbon tax, a carbon market down the road, how does that make this even look better in a life cycle perspective? So we're looking at the entire life of the equipment in the building.
So my one question about that, Devesh, and I'm struggling with, is all the technology changes and the rapid growth of technology in this, and we're putting in magnetic chillers that are going to reduce our costs 50%. What if in 5 years there's another type of chiller that comes out that reduces the cost another 50% of what the previous is? I mean, are we seeing technology changing that dynamic and then the life cycle of it?
I think so. I think it might represent some clear sort of big quantum leaps, if you will. But, I've worked with buildings that have been built well back in time. And it's through ingenuity, through innovation and culture to try to figure out how to match. Some of the newer buildings have the scanners, right, the occupancy sensors right when you walk in, which can be great for controlling loads in the building. The older buildings don't have that. What's an approximation of technology to get to that? The buildings that are doing really well, that were built back then, can try to figure out a way to match that in a different way. So that would be my other approach to that answer. But I get it. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. So the life cycle, here's kind of an illustration of, just looking at 5 years. for life cycle. And this could be a real-world scenario. You could be facing the idea that, well, you don't know what you're going to do with your building over the next 5 or 10 years. You have an HVAC that's due for maybe replacement during that period. And this could happen at your home too, to be frank. It happens all the time. So do we do a replacement with a high performance, which would cost us much more the first year, but start to provide a lot of benefits for the next couple of years? Or do we go with the standard performance HVAC replacement, or just do a tune-up? And yeah.
So a new construction, it just off of this slide, it appears to me, if I'm going through the value engineering process and I'm looking at this,
what's the ROI there?
Yeah, what's the ROI to this? That would be my question from this slide.
Yeah, and I think in some of the other analysis we've done, John, the ROI is going to look really good on the probably better on the standard and the tune-ups in a lot of cases than doing the full-blown. At least I say the standard will have a better ROI initially. What we have to try to look at is be really sensitive to what's the market going to be like too.
Exactly.
Right, when we go to sell it.
So you bring up multiple factors. How long are they going to hold this project? You mentioned government, which is forever.
Right.
Right, and then you go into developers, which may be less than 3 years. And so their view of this slide right there is going to be completely different at a period of time and what their investment criteria is, I guess.
Exactly. But what we're trying to basically convey is that it's important to look at the real big picture on this stuff. Where's that market going? Have you looked at what legislation is coming down the road in that marketplace, incentives, et cetera, and just be aware of that. Yeah. All right. Next slide, please. And to that end, what we did here is we try to look at sort of how these things relate, right, between on the top row there, you've got things like asset hold period, which John just mentioned, the capital funds required to do a project, the impact on gross lease rates, impact on expenses and revenue, and then we look on the left, the type of upgrades and the value impact considerations. Sorry, the upgrades are on the left and the value impact considerations are on the top row there. We look at major HVAC equipment with long life cycles. Certainly, we should be able to see a dent on the energy costs, the gross lease rates, and allowing you more net rent. We know there's a lot of capital funds required there. That's the other side of that equation. And then for an asset hold period for over 10 years, we definitely see the marketplace saying yes.
So I'm going to throw a wrench exactly into that. Okay, I was in China last year in Shanghai, and we were at the Shanghai Tower, which is the second tallest office building in the world now. But I asked the engineering and the architectural firm, I said, what is an old building in China? And they said anything after 2008 is old, meaning in a 6-year period, they consider it antiquated. And because technology, when they started developing, is moving so rapidly, they just don't see the use of keeping the building. They more or less recycle the building. So that type scenario. Of course, they have unlimited resources right now, so that's another issue that comes along with that.
That's a whole different situation.
But that changes the whole ballgame. Our average building is, I believe, 37 years old in the U.S., so we have a different perspective, a longer-term perspective.
And we're overhauling those chillers. We're not getting rid of them.
Exactly.
Keeping them as long as they can go.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's just different perspectives that I see going on out there. So.
Very important. Yeah. And I think, but your point is valid because different marketplaces within the U.S. itself in North America, geographically, will have a different eye to this stuff, and so it's important to be aware of that. Great. I think another, an interesting one I have here is something that I'm familiar with on the fourth row down, thermal mass storage. I work with a building in Chicago, which is a leader, and they're really good about, it's an existing building, right? But they modeled the heat transfer properties of the materials in the building, so they're able to figure out how to maximize their demand response revenues on the PGM grid, which buildings get paid for what they offset next to baseline. It's a great way of generating revenue, actually. But to maximize that, they decided to model how the materials hold on to heat so that they could just coast on to one chiller on a hot summer day or even a winter day, extreme winter day, and just be ahead of the market and make that money and avoid the peak emissions as well. It's an added benefit.
So you had an operating efficiency gain, so reduced operating cost out of it, but is there revenue?
The revenue is from the amount that they're below a baseline.
Okay.
The way that system works in that market, if you're in New York or Chicago, if you have a certain baseline and you perform, below that baseline, you get paid a certain amount of dollar per case.
So that's the revenue component.
That's the revenue component.
Cool.
So it made sense for them to go ahead and invest in this modeling exercise with the company to figure this out, and then they know when to turn the lecture on at midnight, for example, on those extreme days, run it, turn all of them on, run them, and then pre-cool the building, I should say. That's the key here. And let the material properties of the building materials take care of it.
And then that's an old school concept.
It is. We do it, a lot of the off-grid type of things are based on some of that stuff. Anyways, I just wanted to throw out some examples. Next slide, please. Okay, so overall life cycle, we don't want to forget about the end of useful life costs, decommissioning, disposal. I know a lot of green buildings try to figure out ways to recover that and make that an opportunity center, not so much a cost center. But that's important to keep in mind. And the next slide, please. So here we have an overview of some steps to consider. We've been all over the place and sort of we're looking at assessment of particular projects or situations, data, the calculations, and then the valuation that happens, right, with the appraisal side, which Theda will be moving us forward with. But we sort of kind of give an outline of what you want to be able to do, in any situation. Certainly, apologize, I might have moved away from the phone. I'm trying to look at my slides a little better here. Data is the first step, right? So work effectively with your facility team, engineer vendors to get the type of data you'll need to do a proper valuation analysis. And it could be an audit, it could be vendor reports on upgrades. Those are good sources of information. Review and adopt the investors. So whatever the investor's performance criteria is, you want to apply that to these numbers. And then of course, the consumption data, actually looking at the baseline situation in the building to be able to plug that in. And we know there's some calculator tools out there that could be accessed, which is the fourth box here at the bottom that can help you not only calculate this, but try to see how the benefits accrue to different potential stakeholders as well. And I think one of them that's new is the BUVC tool, Building Upgrade Value Calculator, which is a very interesting one that does sort of provide for a breakout between tenants and ownership, for example, on benefits and costs. Next slide, please. So, once you've calculated the impacts of tangible high-performance investment benefits, you want to do that in a way that takes into account life cycle, but also bundling of different energy measures together. For example, in the case of energy efficiency, it's very obvious. Or maybe you have some water and energy efficiency. And it's interesting because we talked about the magnetic chiller. That piece of technology already comes bundled with a variable frequency drive and control system upgrade, which are the things you want to consider when you're doing any HVAC upgrade to maximize those benefits. And that's a bit of an engineering side, but it's important to kind of understand that from engineers. That's why we start off with that up top.
Well, integrated systems is something I've worked on, and I think that's very important to the future here, is how to integrate the systems, how well they integrate together.
Exactly. And that can be said for lighting and HVAC together. We talk about occupancy sensors, the whole type of thing there. And of course, we want to be able to translate these financial outputs, considering all the different variables that we've mentioned in terms of the public and tangible benefits. You want to look across the valuation approaches, which one is the preferred for the ownership type you're dealing with, but also maybe some alternatives to look at, right? Based on how this entire suite of tangible and intangible types of things are now becoming more important. I think I'll leave it there. I just want to throw out a couple of these steps here. Next slide, please. All right.
And with that, we'll move over to Theda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John and Devesh. I hope your insights on valuation will enlighten others to get past the blue screens at their companies. A quick reminder to the audience that we will be sending the slides out after the webinar, as I'm sure many of you would like to take another look at John and Devesh's metrics for valuation again. Please send in any questions you may have through the webinar chat box on your screen. We are collecting those for our Q&A period at the end of the session. Next, let's hear from Theda at Sustainable Values, who is working with DOE to help develop much-needed training for the appraiser industry. Appraisers' understanding of green building benefits is critical to ensuring that buyers purchase buildings that meet their comfort and operational expectations, and sellers receive appropriate compensation for the effort and capital spent improving and maintaining their buildings. Without an appraisal process that values sustainability, these benefits are not captured, and there is less incentive for owners and other stakeholders to invest in greening their assets. Next slide, please. Dee, take it away.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to start with two of my favorite quotes relative to this topic. The first is from Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, and that is, "We know the price of everything and the value of nothing." And I find that very applicable when you are evaluating various types of the benefits of various types of green strategies, particularly with the markets and owners' emphasis on price as opposed to actual long-term value. And to that point, the next quote, which is what market participants, owners, investors, etc., what the market values is what equals market value. And market value is the premise by which the vast majority of real estate in the United States is valued. Next slide, please. First of all, I'd like to thank John and Devesh for their excellent primer on valuation. They've covered a lot of the technical aspects very well, and also touched on many of the salient points that I think are really important when you're trying to assess the benefits of energy efficiency and high-performing strategies. The issue of feasibility on various systems and what contribution they could make, how they might impact highest and best use, which is a primary determinant of a property's potential market value. Also, the sales comparison approach. Despite the fact that there have been increases in the numbers of sales of property, it's still a relatively small statistical pool of data. So this remains a challenge for the valuation community that relies heavily on that type of empirical data. Also, they're pointing out that a reduction in expenses could increase NOI, which inevitably could lead to an increase in value. And finally, the mention of the need for life cycle cost analysis. Whereas in the valuation world it's fairly prevalent in machinery and equipment, it is not used that commonly in the valuation of buildings. And I think going forward it could be much more valuable because it recognizes the contribution of systems that last longer, cost less, can impact capital expenses in a very significant way, and overall obsolescence factors related to buildings as well. Next slide. So I think it's also important for the audience to recognize there are a number of challenges that face appraisers. We've mentioned several times a heavy reliance on market and empirical data. One of the greatest challenges, since there aren't necessarily a really large pool of sales, is the issue of confidentiality, and that is the fact that the majority of building owners do not choose to share their operating data. And it's within operating data that a lot of the benefits that fall to properties from energy efficiency and more high-performing systems can be realized. So what's happened to date is that investors looking for financial validation have found the data to be insufficient. That's why the tools that the DOE is creating, the sharing of information among investors, the market overall will go a long way to creating the appropriate validation that's needed. Finally, there are a number of perceptions that are changing relative to value and performance. The types of value you're looking at relative to performance, the number of organizations signing on to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment that increase the criteria for their investments substantially and beyond just bottom line economic performance. And finally, one of the largest is the vernacular and principles that apply to higher performing properties that have not been typically part of the vocabulary of the appraisal industry in the past. Broader concepts such as externalities. I think Devesh mentioned commissioning, which is not a term that necessarily that many appraisers are familiar with, but need to be, or right sizing. Next slide. So I mentioned performance. I think this is one of the most critical that we need to understand is changing. Performance as a building characteristic you won't find in too many sales comparison charts, but it's being interpreted and expanded at the concept of performance at many different levels. For example, at the building level, the increase in benchmarking, particularly through legislative policies, has been significant, and this creates a much higher level of transparency and greater mechanisms for buildings to be assessed. At the management level, instead of just an appraiser necessarily assuming competent management, if it's a high-performing building, they're looking for management that will be able to continually continually assess and upgrade the property. And at the tenant level, you're finding a lot more informed tenant base that's looking for the performance of the building from the perspective of how it will impact their own occupancy costs as well as their work environment. Next slide. I think one thing, too, that also has to be considered is risk. Risk is a critical factor in the determinant of market value. It's critical to investors. It's critical to underwriters and lenders. And it's applied in a variety of perspectives. From a performance perspective, how will a building that has energy efficient upgrades be compared to its peers? Will it be deemed a less risky investment? What's the probability of the success of some of the new technologies? Is there a high probability or a lower probability? If it's higher, then obviously it'll be a less risky investment. And the characterization of risk is not only just market, it's and economic. It also goes to environmental through a location, potentially social, and also the issue of future proofing. If you make an investment in your building today, a lot of investors have found that they have shorter term investment horizons. But if you flip that around and say they don't make the investment, they don't increase the energy efficiency of their building, how marketable will it be when they get ready to sell it? And the reason this is so critical is it relates directly to your choice of discount rates and capitalization rates that were being discussed earlier. The less risky an investment is, then the lower the rate and the higher the value. So there is a very direct correlation. Next slide, please. So how can market participants be more proactive? I hear this all the time, and it is truly, and I'll say this, I'll repeat myself here, it's about informing and not influence. So owners and investors, in the scope of work upon which they engage an appraiser, they can mention and note special systems, specific strategies that they have undertaken, and request that those be evaluated. Now, the valuation professional is the one that makes the final determination of what's included, but certainly if the request is out there, in most cases it should and could be honored. Also, provide valuation professionals with the information they need. A lot of strategies that have been undertaken aren't that visibly obvious. So making sure appraisers are informed is one of the most critical steps that owners, investors can take. Architects, engineers, and designers provide third-party reports and details about a property's special features. Again, this is not an appraiser's area of expertise, so the more you can do, the more information you can provide to inform them, the better result will be for everyone. And finally, tenants' understanding of what lease options are available, what they may or may not be able to include in their own lease structure that would make to overcome a split incentive or make a division of the cost of an upgrade more equitable between tenant and owner is very important. I would suggest that tenants become informed shoppers, and then they can drive the market more effectively and be much happier in the space that they occupy. Next slide, please. Know where you fit in the process. Whichever role you're playing and involved in evaluation, remember what you're trying to accomplish. What positive role can you play in the appraisal process? Know your strengths, what information you can bring, and your limitations. I believe that the appraisers working on complex, high-performance, energy-efficient buildings, you are well served with someone with a degree of experience. It's a valuation of field is a field that the more experience you get, the more value add you can provide. And in many instances where there is not empirical data, you really need to rely on that experience of an appraiser that has had a broad background and ability to incorporate a variety of factors. And finally, I mentioned the words inform, not influence. At the end of the day, it is the market and the market data that's a final determinant of value. So provide the information you can and allow the appraiser to evaluate it objectively and to the best of their ability. Next slide. So what's already out there to help? There are a number of factors and resources. One, the Appraisal Foundation has created a set of guidelines. One is finalized on background and core competency. There is a residential set of guidelines advisory out for exposure, and soon there will be a commercial advisory out looking for public input. The Appraisal Institute has green addendums, one for residential and one for commercial. They serve as very good checklists to look and make sure that you can not only note but see, ensure that the systems and upgrades, et cetera, that have been included in a building get recognized. The Institute for Market Transformation also has various publications that they have worked on, and some in concert with the Appraisal Institute, that provide guidance and case studies. And finally, the Department of Energy. Portfolio Manager has an enormous amount of very useful data that can be gleaned from the information discerned in that. The DOE's asset score for buildings, and also the Buildings Performance Database, all have information that could be very helpful in determining points of difference for buildings and potential valuation factors. Next slide. So we're back to my first two. Please remember not to be driven completely by cost, but look at buildings in terms of value and the value that these strategies bring to them, and recognize it's not that individual appraiser, but their evaluation of the market and the market data that's going to result in market value. Thank you.
Thanks, Vidi. I'd like to point out specific resources provided by our presenters, which the audience can access once you get the slides and use to start addressing some of the issues that we've talked about. So the first one, we have a publication by Vidi titled High Performance Green Building, What is it worth? And if you click that and read more, you'll be able to find out more about investigating the market value of high performance green buildings. The second one, we have a report by the Appraisal Foundation on valuation of green and high performance property, including core competency for appraisers. Next slide, please. So we have a bunch of different questions from the audience, very good questions. So let's take some time to answer some of these. And if you have ongoing questions, please feel free to keep typing into the chat box. Okay, so for John and Devesh, can the problem of split incentives for energy improvements between building owners and tenants be addressed during the valuation process?
Yeah, I think, you know, I sort of hinted to the green lease opportunity, the idea that, you know, you can make the tenants aware of the opportunity for them to have a better performing space that they're going to occupy for the next 5 to 10 years, both in terms of financially, but also, you know, the comfort level. Not that that's not something I mean, that's a standard thing. Comfort's expected, but the point would be a lot of the tenants are not looking at their own utility bills. If they're national tenants, they're warehousing these bills. They're going somewhere else. There may be a green initiative a tenant may have, but it's somewhere centrally managed. And I think the opportunity there's a great interest for the base building engineers to want to try to get the tenant spaces to perform. Well, at a certain level.
And I agree with you. We're moving in that direction, Devesh. The split incentive is still a barrier in my mind because until we monitor each individual tenant's consumption and demand,
right,
and compare them, because you may have what I call a heavy user next door to a light user, and in our structure today, we're pro rata sharing that out to each one, so no one pays for the fact that they may be a heavy user compared to a light user. So I still see it as a barrier, and we're moving closer to that with, you know, wireless meters and many other things. I think that's going to transform in the future. And to your point, the best way to start out is with the green lease on it that would imply that you need to utilize those type of standards. But I think that's where we're headed.
Well, I think that's a good point. I was actually referring to more of a triple net lease Class A type of situation. But even in those situations, there's lack of awareness of what's going on with the energy. But I totally agree when you have these pro rata type situations. The one interesting situation I did run into that is like an industrial flex space where I think the ownership was not seeing any increase in rents, but operating costs over time, they saw it going up, especially energy. They're like, we want to try in our next building to put some solar panels in and then charge a little higher a bit on the rent, but show the operating cost to be lower as a way to kind of get around this. So just want to throw that out there.
So what we just did is go through 3 or 4 different stakeholders with different perceptions. I think that's a part of education.
Yes.
I hope that answers the question.
Sub-metering is also another area of innovation going on, which is key.
The wireless sub-metering, I think, is key to it, yes.
Circuit-based, wireless, behavior change programs with tenants, all of this stuff can help here. So.
Great, thanks. This is also directed towards you guys. So in practice, utility bills fluctuate. Green scores, such as Energy Star, also change over time, and not always in an upward direction. How does the uncertainty of future savings come into the picture?
Well, let me address the fluctuation that we see first, and I'll let you address how that changes, Devesh, if you don't mind. You know, a lot of the product that transformed over the past 10 years has been downtown core Class A type buildings that we've seen, and now we're starting to see it branch out. And, you know, in utilizing Energy Star, we all know that they take in all the data from all the buildings and they create the median out there. So 50%, or I'm sorry, the 50 number is what is going up or down. If we're incorporating more buildings, and what we see out there is that the buildings that are coming into Energy Star have high demands at this point in time, and it is going to lower it down. We have to actually understand that's a very good problem to have, because we're actually moving the challenge buildings into the project. Does that support the Class A buildings in downtown? It makes them look better in that regard, but does that increase their value, which is back to this valuation component? So I'll throw that at your feet.
Well, let me tie what you're saying there. So if you have more energy intensive use of the building,
yes,
over time with the newer buildings, the newer types of build outs, the capacity to be able to handle that higher load or occupancy intensity, I should say, is part and parcel of the whole high performance equation. When you put in a high performance piece of equipment building, you're designing it to, because it's that much more efficient, it can handle that much more of that type of load. I'm speaking in terms of energy here, but
so, you know, so the densification issue you're referring to is we're putting more people in more buildings, but with the efficiency we can handle those buildings. Does that not negate that at some point in time, or?
Well, I think it's, when we're looking at valuation, though, it's the one that has the better efficiency in this kind of environment is going to have a higher, hopefully, I would see a reflection in the marketplace of.
I've always wondered, if you put in more tenants, should your rent go up? So, you know, that's a TD question I'm going to there.
Well, and that goes back to the example we gave of the occupancy vacancy type of impact. So, you know, the uncertainty of future savings. Well,
I don't know. I fly all the time and I haven't seen my airline bill go down, even though gas prices have been cut in half. I'm not quite sure how that fluctuates, but I'd like to see that.
That's a good price. And a lot of the utilities, natural gas being a big part of that. But I remember being in South Florida in 2008 when the gas was going to go up, and that's a direct translation of great impact. When their fuel costs go up, it's directly passed on.
Well, that's required by the government.
Right. So I think what I'll say, the only thing I'll say to that in addition is that there's other influences that are on the intangible side that you want to take into account. There's an expectation eventually in the marketplace that, oh, this is a green building, right? Even if they, you know, we're not able to see, if we do see changes in fuel costs, et cetera, they may go up and down. We still have this other expectation in the marketplace to address.
Well, and I think there's still the issue of every state governs its own PUC or Public Utility Commission, and every state has its own rules and regulations. So what's transparent in one state may not be transparent in another state based on what legislation is created there. You see that?
Oh, absolutely. And then like what I mentioned with the revenue opportunity in some of the grids, you know, just the incentives and the tariff structures, et cetera, they're very different, and they incentivize different types of levels of efficiency. Yeah.
So the incentives are something that's not, I think, that is standardized in the industry. So to make those changes transparent in every way, it would be great if they would be standardized in the industry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to end on that point. Thank you.
Great, thanks guys. Dee, we have a bunch of questions for you about how owners can really make sure that their building's improvements are accounted properly. Can you give an example of what owners specifically can do for that?
Sure. I think it's important, if possible, for the appraiser to be able to talk to the architects or engineers that were involved to really get determination and understanding of the goals that were, you know, and objectives of any type of special features or upgrades. If it's an existing building or new, I mean, commissioning reports, energy modeling, which is effectively a third-party sign-off on projections that otherwise, if an appraiser makes based on market peers, won't be able to validate possibly the same level of savings that the modeling could. And it would be accepted as an expert report. So those types of inputs could be very valuable.
Thank you. I'm seeing some other general questions about what type of reading the audience can go do to learn more about this appraisal process and opportunities for incorporating green measures. And I would say please click on those resources that you will see once you get the slides after this talk. That high performance value publication that Dee worked on is a great place to start. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions on this webinar right now, but if you have anything unanswered, please reach out to our speakers after the end. And next slide, please. So we'll hope that you plan to attend the next Better Buildings webinar titled Strategies for Tenant Engagement. Registration is now opened for our next talk about energy in lease spaces. Are you wondering how to tackle energy and water efficiency in leased tenant spaces? A representative from DOE will discuss technological barriers, opportunities, and collaborative approaches to promoting energy and water efficiency in tenant spaces. Cushman & Wakefield will highlight its recent efforts to integrate energy efficiency into the design and construction of tenant spaces and other measures they have taken to reduce water and energy consumption. Next slide, please. I'd like to remind our audience that our annual Better Buildings Summit is coming up on May 9th through 11th in Washington, D.C. This is our once-a-year in-person meeting of Better Buildings partners, affiliates, and interested stakeholders to share best practices, be recognized for their work, and network. Registration is now open to the public, and we hope that you will join us. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce the audience to the Better Buildings Challenge Swap, an effort to market the work that energy teams engage in to a wider audience via a fun and informative channel. So we've created a reality series featuring the Whole Foods Market and Hilton Worldwide energy teams who swap buildings and help each other identify further energy saving opportunities. Please click on the link to watch the swap webisodes when the slides go out, or if you can't wait that long, please Google Better Buildings Swap. Next slide. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists very much for taking the time to be with us today. Feel free to contact our presenters directly with additional questions, or if we weren't able to get to your question during the Q&A period. If you'd like to learn more about the Better Buildings Challenge or Alliance, please check out our website or feel free to contact me directly at the email shown. I encourage you to follow the Better Buildings Initiative on Twitter for all the latest information. You will receive an email notice when the archive of this session is available online. Thanks, everyone.